You know, Natlan is pretty different from other nations. It's this place where people not only coexist with dragonkind, but due to their incredibly frail ley line system, they're also constantly at risk of being swallowed by the abyss, which also means they're constantly fighting the abyss and dying in the process. But that's okay, because they can come back from the dead if everyone sings the Ode of Resurrection together. And then we've got all this stuff about the Sacred Flame, the Wayob, the Ancient Names, the Night Souls, the Night Kingdom, the Saurians, a lineage of mortal pyro archons, which is also incredibly unusual, plus the Phlogiston mystery, and I really think all of this stuff could use a little bit more explaining, don't you? Well, don't you worry about a thing, because explaining everything is what we're gonna do today, because I have spent quite a bit of time dissecting and analyzing all of these topics, trying to piece together a more accurate vision of what Natlan is and how all these things work together. But I do gotta warn you, there's a lot of stuff that the game hasn't really explained yet, so I'm gonna have to fill in some blanks with some speculation. But even then, I feel like I've got a pretty good handle on things, and I might even understand how Mavuika's plan to save Natlan is actually gonna pan out. You know, the plan she has to drive the abyss out of Natlan. So I'll be attempting to explain that too, but in order to explain this plan and how all of these newfangled terms and ideas fit together, we're gonna need a really basic understanding of Natlan's history. But I don't really want to tell you Natlan's history first and then explain each idea and concept individually, because the two are really interconnected and I think one doesn't really make sense without the other, so I'm gonna give you Natlan's history and the explanations for each thing as it comes up within its historical context. But that does mean I am not going to be giving you a complete and comprehensive timeline, but if you would like one, Clementine put together a pretty great little timeline video that I'm gonna link in the description. And while you're down there in the description box, you can also find more useful things like timestamps, spoiler warnings, and citations. So definitely make sure to check that out. Well, now that I've set some proper expectations for what you've gotten yourself into, it's time to sit back, relax, and finally figure out what the heck is going on in Natlan. So ever since Entombed released, we've known that the original civilization in Teyvat was a civilization of dragons. But what we didn't know is that this civilization of dragons was a highly advanced civilization. I'm talking sci-fi machinery level advanced. Which means that when Celestia arrived and tried to claim Teyvat for the unborn humans, they weren't just fighting these draconic manifestations of nature, but also a whole space-age army of draconic machinery, which is wild to me. But despite this new information, Celestia did emerge victorious in the end, and only the remnants of dragonkind survived. But many of the Bishop survivors took refuge in Natlan under the protection of the Pyro Sovereign, HoYoCreators. But HoYoCreators had grown weak and had been infected by abyssal power. The Obsidian Codex even describes them as a gray corpse. Now, this abyssal infection may have been the result of the Dragon King Nibelung attempting to use the power of the abyss to fight back against Celestia's invading army, only to lose control of it, but we don't really know for sure. But the Dragon Kings were losing the war, and their power was starting to wane. But still, what remained of dragonkind continued to struggle violently against the waves of change that Celestia brought with it. It was a pretty brutal time. But one dragon did not care for all this violence and believed that the era of dragons was reaching its inevitable conclusion. It was time to look towards the future, a future where humans were the dominant race, and not dragons. This dragon was known as HoYoCreators Ubakan. Now at this point in time, humans were still quite primitive, and HoYoCreators Ubakan wanted to bring them knowledge and power with which they could develop a proper civilization. So he stole a crystal known as pyrophosphorite, which contained a powerful liquid fire known as Phlogiston from the corpse of the Pyro Sovereign, and thus he became known as the Sage of the Stolen Flame. At this point in the game, you can probably think of Phlogiston as like a magic ink made of pyro energy that one can use to create things as if you painted them into existence with a brush. This process is called phlogiston carving, and we've seen it used to create things like the spirit waves. Now this seems to be phlogiston's primary use, but it also has a lot of other properties as well, like repelling the abyss, which makes sense because it is raw elemental energy and the abyss is naturally repelled by that, so there's that. And I'm also fairly certain, although the game hasn't outright said this yet, that the phlogiston is to the Pyro Sovereign what the primordial sea is to the Hydro Sovereign. So it's super important stuff we're probably going to learn a lot more about going forward. But again, I think this simplistic explanation is pretty okay for now. Anyway, in order to support this upcoming new race of humankind, HoYoCreators Ubakan intended to pass the power and knowledge of the phlogiston on to a worthy human who would then share it with the rest of humankind. Very Prometheus-like. That worthy human was named Cha'ak, and Cha'ak also received a prophecy from him claiming that from his heirs would come the savior of two worlds, and one day he should slay the Pyro Sovereign and ascend to Archonhood. Cha'ak did exactly as HoYoCreators Ubakan wanted and shared the phlogiston with his tribe, and together they defeated a raging dragon. perhaps one close to the Pyro Sovereign. It's never really clarified, but I'm assuming it was kind of like whatever Scylla was to Neuvillette. Not quite a sovereign, but a dragon that may have taken command in the absence of their leader. So after this mystery dragon was defeated, Cha'ok's tribe became officially recognized as Natlan's very first tribe of, this new era of humankind. Now, I think this tribe is the People of the Springs, because Cha'ok is another name for Tlaloc, which is a Mayan rain and storm deity who ruled over the heavenly realm of Ilhuicuatl-Metzli, and Metzli is another name for the People of the Springs. Now, I could be wrong about this because Mualani's whole quest talks about the very first chief of the People of the Springs, and weirdly, they never name him, so I have no idea if he is Cha'ok or if Cha'ok was never chief, or if I'm completely off about which tribe was his. Regardless, at the end of his life, Cha'ok climbed a mountain and used the power of the Phlogiston to light the first flame. This is the Sacred Flame, also known as the Primal Fire. Now, the Sacred Flame basically functions as abyss repellent because it's pure pyro energy, and as I mentioned earlier, elemental energy is one of the most effective methods of countering and repelling the abyss. Which also means that these little Phlogiston checkpoints throughout Natlan are also little mini Sacred Flame beacons that can help keep the abyss at bay throughout the entire nation. So that's neat. So after lighting the Sacred Flame, Cha'ok then called out to all of his loved ones who had died before him, and the god of the Night Kingdom responded, which gave birth to the very first Wayob. Okay, so before we continue, I should probably explain what the Night Kingdom is, what a Wayob is, and why they're connected to the Sacred Flame, because otherwise the rest of this whole video is not going to make any sense at all. But I've got to do this with some really weird metaphors because the whole thing is a little bit difficult to explain, so just stick with me, okay? I want you to pause for a second and think of Teyvat as consisting of two parts, a physical world and an immaterial world. Now, these two worlds are like two halves of the same coin, and they mirror each other. If something exists on one side of the coin, then it will also exist on the other side of the coin. So this physical world is basically the one you traverse with your body, and the immaterial world is the one that you traverse with your mind. Now, this physical world that your body interacts with is full of real physical objects that follow real predictable rules and patterns. But this immaterial world that you only interact with your mind only operates in concepts and memories, things that are chaotic and uncontrollable and intangible. Now, as far as the game is concerned, you can't really have one of these worlds without the other. So while you are in Teyvat, you exist as a physical entity, but beneath your feet is an immaterial reflection of you. It's a conceptual version of you, and it's also an accumulation of all of your memories. And this immaterial you exists within the ley lines, typically. So as you navigate the physical world of Teyvat, your immaterial reflection follows you through the ley lines. It's a bit like walking past a lake and watching your reflection follow you on the surface of the water. The ley lines are the water, and the immaterial mind is the reflection on the surface. Now, the ley lines are essentially the veins of memories and elemental energy that function as a sort of root system of the world tree, which is Irminsul, which means that Irminsul is the cumulative memory of the entire world because every single person in it is connected to it. Now, that means that anything that affects Irminsul will also affect anyone who has a reflection of themselves within the water of the ley lines. For example, when Wanderer deleted the world's memory of him, everyone's immaterial self within the ley lines also forgot him. And since the immaterial self is a reflection of the physical self was altered to match the immaterial self. Now, if we continue to think of these concepts or memories within the ley lines in terms of water, and instead of thinking of them as a lake, we think of the ley lines as pipes or rivers, then the Night Kingdom is basically like a reservoir used to capture all of the water or memories that have leaked out of the ley line system. Now, Natlan's ley lines are exceptionally fragile and weak, and honestly a bit broken in some places, which is why there's so much spillage out of the ley lines, enough to form the Night Kingdom. But this Night Kingdom is in effect like a body of stagnant water that can't really move effectively through the pipes, right? Because the pipes are kind of broken. So when people in Natlan are wandering around Natlan, their reflection can follow them pretty effectively. But if they were to leave Natlan, it's possible that their reflection just can't follow them properly through the ley lines because the ley lines are so broken. And because the connection between the physical and the mental self becomes a bit unstable, example, the people of Natlan who leave Natlan experience things like memory loss and emotional instability. Now, it's important to note that a Wayob can act as a bridge between the physical and immaterial self and allow a Natlanian to leave Natlan, but this comes with its own risks. Wayobs kind of help manage the Abyss's presence within the Night Kingdom, and the Night Kingdom is working as a supplementary system to the ley lines in Natlan. So if you're using the Wayob's power to leave Natlan, then the Wayob's not able to use their own power to suppress the Abyss in Natlan, and that can obviously have some pretty disastrous consequences. We'll come back to the Wayobs in a bit, but there is some benefit to having this stagnant water of the Night Kingdom in Natlan, because this might actually be the reason why you can even resurrect people in the first place. Cause see, after death, one's spirit or mind or memories will linger for quite a while in the Night Kingdom, or even in the ley lines if you're elsewhere. And if you're able to locate that spirit, then you could, in theory, re-link it to the physical body like we did with Kachina. My hypothesis is that it's easier to find spirits in the Night Kingdom as opposed to finding them in the ley lines, but I don't really have a lot of substantial evidence for that, so take that with a grain of salt. And as an aside, I do think it's possible that the Night Kingdom predates the ley lines as a system, and that the ley lines themselves are a means of containing or controlling the Night Kingdom. To use the water metaphor again, it's a bit like if you put the tree's roots in a pond so that they could suck up all of the water in that pond, and then all of that water would be trapped within the tree and no longer in the pond. Which would also mean that if you were to go inside of the ley lines, they might look and behave just like the Night Kingdom, but contained within some root systems. And if this is the case, then Natlan's ley lines may be considered fragile because Irminsul's roots might not have finished growing into the region before they were irreparably damaged, which they were, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, the sacred flame that Cha'ak lit using Phlogiston acts as a link between the physical world and the immaterial world, which in this case is the Night Kingdom. And I'm also pretty sure that the Night Kingdom is supposed to be a reference to Xibalba, which is basically like the realm of the dead in Mayan mythology, and that's why spirits go there when you die. But this linking function of the sacred flame is why the Pyro Archon has to enter the flame in order to, quote, cross over the border between life and death to physically retrieve a lost soul or memory from the Night Kingdom. If this process sounds kind of familiar to you, it might be because a lot of these themes are present in Arlecchino. Her constellation, Ignis Purgatorius, refers to the fires of purgatory, or that intermediary state between life and death, for example. She also has a lot of references as a link between two worlds, and as you might remember, Wahaklahun Uba Khan predicted that a descendant of Cha'ak would become a ruler of two worlds, which to me means that he is the ruler of both the living and the dead, or the mind and the body. So Cha'ak lit this sacred flame which acted as a gateway between the land of the living and the land of the dead, and then he called out to his deceased companions, which means in a sense he was calling out to the dead through a gateway that linked to the realm of the dead. But what answered his call wasn't the voice of his companions, but the voice of the very first Wayob. And this is where it gets really cool, because as far as I can tell, a Wayob is a collective consciousness that exists only in the Night Kingdom. There are 6 known Wayob, 1 for each tribe of Natlan, so I'm going to make the assumption that each Wayob is actually the collective souls and memory and consciousness of the fallen members of each tribe, but probably made up of those who don't possess ancient names, and you'll understand why in a second. So the Wayob inhabit these obsidian pillars called Night Soul Pillars, which function like anchors in this underground sea of consciousness, allowing them to traverse the Night Kingdom freely. The Wayob are also responsible for issuing ancient names, which are carved onto obsidian feathers, the same material as the Night Soul Pillars. Now, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that I think these obsidian feathers with ancient names on them are actually like miniature Night Soul Pillars, which means that they perform the same function as the bigger ones that the Wayob use. They act as anchors in the Night Kingdom, and they also act as a vessel for a collective consciousness, specifically the consciousnesses of all of the people who previously bore that ancient name. And I say this because if you establish a deep connection to your ancient name, you can tap into the memories of all of those who came before you, kind of like you're tapping into a collective consciousness, which basically means that I think ancient name bearers are kind of like mini Wayob, which may be why they possess a Night Soul. It's a gift or a power of the Wayob. And this actually might be why only ancient name bearers are allowed to fight the Abyss in the Night Warden Wars, because their ancient names must function as an anchor within the Night Kingdom, which allows their fallen spirit to be found and then revived after death. Normal people aren't allowed to fight in these wars because the Archon and the Wayob would be unable to find them without an anchor. You remember how Vichama had us create that net in the physical world so that we could create the concept of a net in the Night Kingdom that would then catch Kachina's name so we could find her? That's the idea. Now you might be wondering why, if the Wayob only exist in the Night Kingdom as a collective consciousness, why do we have these physical manifestations of them in the real world? Well, if you remember what I said earlier, the two realms, the Night Kingdom and Teyvat, are mirrors of each other. And that means if something exists in the Night Kingdom, then it is linked to something in Teyvat and vice versa. Again, using the Vichama example, he created a physical net in Teyvat, which created a concept of a net in the Night Kingdom. So these Wayob manifestations are what the Night Soul pillars look like in the physical realm. Now, did you notice how we only have 3 elements for the Wayob so far? And how those match the primary elements of the Saurians for the 3 tribes that we have access to thus far? Hydro for the people of the Springs, Geo for the children of Echoes, and Dendro for the Scions of the Canopy. And did you notice how each tribe's main Wayob pillar has that Saurian etched onto its surface? Well, I don't think that's a coincidence. We know that there are 6 tribes total, which means that if we have 3 right now, there should be 3 other elemental Wayobs to look out for. And I'm guessing that they're going to be Electro, Animo, and Cryo. I'm deliberately excluding Pyro here because I think Pyro is supposed to be represented by the Archon, which has no Wayob representative unless we want to talk about this mysterious mistress of the Night Kingdom we know nothing about, but that's a whole new can of worms I don't want to go into right now. Although it is one of the reasons why I think the Night Kingdom predates the ley lines, but I digress. So we know that Mavuika is looking for 6 heroes with ancient names, 1 from each tribe in order to drive back the Abyss. And so far we have the Geo Shilinin from Echoes, the Dendro Kanich from the Canopy, the Hydro Mualani from the Springs, and the Electro Eonsen of the Plenty. Now that only leaves Cryo and Animo, and I am guessing that Chaska is the Flower Feather rep and she's Animo. And then if you look at this tray of Saurian cookies, at least one of these looks like they're definitely going to be Cryo, so there's that. And plus, if we look at this sun from Mavuika's Mind Palace scene, we see the symbol of each Wayob circling a flame. So unless they want to double up on Pyro, which I don't think they will since all Saurians also seem to have some kind of supplemental Pyro ability, I don't think that the final hero is Pyro, meaning Pyro has to represent the Archon. And yes, I know that the Kukasaurs seem to be Pyro-ish aligned, but keep in mind that the boss version that we fight has the mark of the Flame Lord, which means that they're more of an anomaly than anything else. Anyway, I think this is pretty cool. But before we move on, I want to take a quick moment to point out that the Mayan word for Wayob means the dreamer. And if they are collective consciousnesses that are technically dreaming in this subliminal mind space place, then I cannot deny the fact that it made me think of the Golden Slumber, where a million minds merged into one. Especially since we get this one scene where the Abyss chases us and it's like identical to the Golden Slumber throne room escape sequence. Listen, the foreshadowing is strong with this one, okay? So we know what the Night Kingdom is, we know what the Wayobs are, we've got a pretty good idea of what ancient names do. Let's get back to our guy, Cha'ak, who is dying. But don't worry, because he left behind a very powerful legacy, just like Wahakla Uba Khan prophesied. This prophesied heir of Cha'ak was named Xbalanque, and he is arguably the most important figure in Natlan's history. Now, unfortunately, we don't really know a whole lot about Xbalanque, but we do know that he confronted the revived corpse of the Pyro Sovereign, and he eventually killed him, nearly dying in the process. But this victory, which should have happened around the beginning of the Archon War, I think, allowed for the creation of the divine Pyro Throne, which is a celestial construct made from a dragon sovereign's authority, the same authority that Focalors destroyed back in Fontaine. The creation of the throne allowed Xbalanque to ascend to the position of Archon, claiming the Pyronosis in the process. But Xbalanque had no desire to be a god. In fact, he had a condition for his ascension. He wanted to be able to live out a normal mortal life and then pass on his role as Archon to a worthy successor. And he wanted this process to repeat more or less indefinitely, which is why Natlan has a line of mortal Archons. So he accomplished this by striking a deal with a demon named Ronova, who seems to have taught him the Ode of Resurrection, the song that can call back the souls of the deceased from the Night Kingdom. And this is just really funny to me because the Seelie we know of as the Goddess of Flowers, or Nabu Malikata, was also known for teaching Rukkhadevata her Source Song, which was able to call life back from Irminsul. Rukkhadevata used this song to create the Aranara. So it seems like these songs are kind of the same sort of thing, which means if the Night Kingdom acts to support Natlan's ley lines and the ley lines are the roots of Irminsul, then both songs are technically calling life back from the same type of place. Again, the foreshadowing is strong with this one. Now, Ronova is based on the Ars Goetia demon Renove, who was a reaper of souls, and since this name is referred to in relation to Celestia, many are assuming that Ronova should be the Shade of Death, similar to how Istaroth is assumed to be the Shade of Time. I have a lot of thoughts on this naming convention because I actually think this revelation is kind of cool, but I think we should dig into that another time. Okay, so Xbalanque made a deal with Ronova to establish a cycle of mortal archonhood, and the era of humans has officially begun. I know, that was a lot of work to get there. But in claiming Natlan for the humans, he ends up freeing a half-human, half-saurian prisoner from the dragons. Now, this prisoner is named Ochkan, and Ochkan revered Xbalanque, so when Xbalanque entered the sacred flame and kind of just vanished from history, Ochkan was distraught. He seized leadership of Natlan's capital, the Cinder City, and thus it became known as Ochkanatlan. And Xbalanque became known as the one entombed in Primal Fire, because the sacred flame is the Primal Fire, and that's where he disappeared to. Which, as a side note, might mean that he's not dead at all, because Mavuika actually time traveled by entering the sacred flame, so it's very possible that Xbalanque could do the exact same thing. Will he? I don't know, but I'm just saying it's possible based on the information that we have right now. As a second side note, it's also possible that Wahaklahun Ubakan and Ochkan are the same person, meaning between the era of Cha'ak and Xbalanque, Wahaklahun Ubakan would have been captured by the dragons and then eventually freed by Xbalanque and then taken the name of Ochkan. Again, this is just a possibility and I can't confirm it one way or another, so I'm gonna just keep referring to them as separate people for now. Now, Ochkan would don a mask and therefore be referred to as the Sacred Lord by the people. He was considered a tyrant and unreasonably hostile towards Saurians, but he also didn't think too highly of humans, although he was responsible for studying the machines of the ancient dragons and decoding the Phlogiston carvings that powered them. And although he only had a rudimentary understanding of this Phlogiston programming language, the knowledge was still of great benefit to the people and he did share it with them. But despite that, Ochkan wasn't thought of very fondly by the people, and so a small group of people led by the Scarlet-Eyed Boy led a rebellion against him, but struggled because Ochkan had the power of the sacred flame, which he could then take bits of and use as a weapon to burn his enemies to a crisp. So one of the Scarlet-Eyed Boy's companions, Yipankwi, stole some of these flames and set Ochkan's army on fire, only to be consumed by the flames himself, thus earning him the name Turnfire. Now, this fire burned a hole through the ley lines and apparently continues to burn in the Night Kingdom. As an aside, I don't think that the Turnfire is what broke the ley lines, but I do think that the Turnfire made the situation with the ley lines worse. Incidentally, Turnfire is Kenich's ancient name. Let's just hope he doesn't meet the same end. Anyway, the Scarlet-Eyed Boy offered his heart to the sacred flame, entered the flame, and then became the next Archon. And then, thousands of years later, Conria failed to stop the disaster in their nation and a cataclysm was unleashed throughout Tevat. The Archon of this time period was Mavuika, and although she fought desperately alongside very powerful companions, which also resulted in the formation of the Merjavari wasteland, the damage caused by the Abyss was far too great for Natlan's weak ley lines to manage, and without the support of stable ley lines, over time, the Abyss began slowly leaching into the Night Kingdom. And in about 500 years, the Abyss would swallow the Night Kingdom completely, and Natlan along with it. Because remember, the Night Kingdom is a supplementary ley line system, so Mavuika hatched a plan that she never went into much detail on, but from what I can gather, her plan was to enter the sacred flame and travel to a different point in time 500 years into the future, where she could then gather 6 ancient name-bearing heroes, one from each tribe, and together they could fight back the Abyss. In the meantime, the people of Natlan would work to keep the sacred flame burning and to rebuild their civilization that had been destroyed by the Cataclysm. And not gonna lie, that is a vague as hell plan. So with our history lesson out of the way, allow me to attempt to fill in the blanks of her plan with some educated speculation. And I'm gonna warn you up front, this may involve some Fontanian physics. Although I won't talk about the time travel, even though I'm really excited that Bach's time theory got confirmed. Roosevelt and I did a really big high five over that one. Okay, so right now the biggest enemy of Natlan is the Abyss, and the only thing keeping the Abyss at bay is the sacred flame, which is losing its effectiveness. And as we established earlier, this sacred flame was born of the seed of Phlogiston that was stolen from the Pyro Sovereign, meaning it's essentially the purest form of pyro-elemental energy you can get. And we know from multiple places in the game, as well as the Natlan Archon quest itself, that elemental energy is actually quite effective effective at repelling the abyss, and is in fact some of the best ways to repel the abyss. Now, the sacred flame is fed the contending fire that is generated by combatants during the pilgrimage of the return of the sacred flame, and it represents pure pyro energy. But according to Mavuika, contending fire is essentially equated to the memories that a person generates through their deeds, and she also goes on to explain that the purpose of contending fire is similar to that of an ancient name, and the purpose of an ancient name is to accumulate the memories of everyone who has bore that name. It's a legacy, a history, a story that you can pull secret strength from. So, in essence, the cumulative memories of Natlan's people fuel the sacred flame. Keep this in mind. So in the beginning of this video, I talked about how the Dragon King Xbalanque tried to leverage the power of the Abyss in his effort to defeat Celestia. But when you stop to think about this is a really weird thing for Xbalanque to want to do, because Neuvillotte's 5th character story suggests that Xbalanque actually wanted to oppose the Black Void, which is the Abyss. Now, frankly, I'm not quite sure how these two goals of using the Abyss to fight off Celestia and then also wanting to oppose the Abyss line up with each other, but the fact that Xbalanque even wanted to oppose the Void at all is a fascinating concept in light of Natlan's Archon quest. See, Neuvillotte seems to think that Xbalanque's plan to oppose the Abyss on his own was flawed, and that it would have been better if every life banded together as one and tried to oppose the Abyss together instead. And what's really funny about Neuvillotte's plan is that it might actually be pretty effective. Throughout the whole game, we've seen countless instances where many people come together as one, sometimes using the Traveler as a conduit, in order to oppose a dark power or a looming threat. And I bring it up because I think this is what Mavuika's plan to defeat the Abyss is, although her plan is a bit more mechanically complex. Hear me out. Ancient name bearers are basically miniature Wayobs. They're someone who can inherit the collective will and memories of all who came before them. They can then take these previous lives and combine them so that they act as one source of strength. And Mavuika needs 6 of these ancient name heroes in order to successfully oppose the Abyss. That is the extent of what we know. But if more people are more power, then it would make sense that she would time travel 500 years into the future, because that is 500 years of name accumulation and story accumulation that she could get per ancient name. Now, you might be wondering, why not just use every ancient name bearer, and even though you'd have less stories per name, at least you'd have more names overall? And to that I'd say it's probably an issue of balance. She says she needs 6 ancient names, 1 name from each tribe, and we know that each tribe and each Wayob is represented by a single element. So that's 6 out of the 7 elements, with Mavuika presumably being the 7th element of Pyro, right? And theoretically, she should also represent the accumulated memories and history of all other Pyro Archons that came before her, because those are stored in the Sacred Flame and passed on to each Archon as they ascend, which basically means that the position of Archon itself is an ancient name, at least functionally. In this way, she could have a full spectrum of powerful elemental wills that could effectively repel the Abyss, because again, elemental energy is one of the best repellents for the Abyss. But when you combine all of the elements together, you end up with one complete ball of light, this golden light that we usually see possessed by the Traveler, right? This is their purification power. Except I don't think this is actually the power of purification. I think this is an annihilation reaction. See, I told you we were going to talk about Fontaine physics. So here's the thing. Elemental energy and the Abyss are polar opposites. Elemental energy represents the physical makeup of the world, right? Like, it's the actual matter that the world is made from, whereas the Abyss is kind of like a void, or maybe we could call it the antimatter. So when matter and antimatter meet each other, they create something called an annihilation reaction. This is a real thing that happens in real physics. Fontaine wasn't just making things up, okay? Numa and Osea are technically matter and antimatter, creating an annihilation reaction. And this is where our big brain goes big bang, because scientists have long theorized that the Big Bang should have created an equal amount of both matter particles and antimatter particles. But the issue is that when a particle meets its exact opposite, as we've already discussed, the two annihilate each other. So if you did have an equal amount of both matter and antimatter particles, you would be left with basically nothing but raw energy, or raw light. So in order for the universe to exist as we know it, particles of matter have to outnumber particles of antimatter, which again means that if we want to push back the abyss, we need more elemental energy than there is abyss energy. Now you might be wondering, why then do we need all of these collective consciousnesses? Surely leveraging pure elemental power should be enough, right? No. You remember how I was talking about how the physical world and the mental world are reflections of each other? Well, the physical world is made of elemental energy, and the immaterial world, this reflected world, is made out of memories. And because they reflect each other, you can also say that they can transmute into each other. Thoughts can become things, and things can become thoughts. So by accumulating a ton of memories, Mavuika can essentially transmute them into raw elemental energy. And if she can do this successfully, which I think is possible because she will also have the assistance of the Traveler, who is capable of performing annihilation reactions on their own, then she can take all of that elemental energy and perform a proper annihilation reaction and force the abyss out of Natlan for good, which might have been what Xbalanque was trying to do in the first place. But he was trying to do it on his own and using his own power, and that just wasn't enough. And the icing on the cake for me when I realized all of this was this scene here, which should look pretty familiar. Basically, we're using elemental energy in order to create an annihilation reaction to drive the abyss out of the Night Soul pillar. And we did something incredibly similar in Xbalanque when we purified the abyss from Durin. Maybe we didn't use elemental energy there, but we did use the power of words, and the power of words are quite similar, at least allegorically, to the power of memories. So I'll take it. As an added bonus, the Wayob Night Soul pillars boast a striking similarity to celestial nails, and one of the features of these nails is that they suppress the abyss. And much like the Night Soul pillars, celestial nails can and often do get overpowered by the abyss and stop working. Again, perhaps because the abyss starts to outnumber the power of the celestial nail. Now, I don't really know how deep this relationship between the nails and the Wayob go, but there is a celestial nail found by the Turnfire in the Night Kingdom that's been overpowered by the abyss, similar to how the nail in the chasm was, and the chasm also has a lot of strange similarities with the Night Kingdom, which is weird on its own. But regardless of all of that, having the Wayob pillars be sort of homegrown celestial nails and also host to a collective consciousness makes you wonder what the heck a celestial nail even is. If we go by color theory, then celestial nails are actually concentrated memory bombs, because in Genshin, this blue color is the color of memories, and the gold color is the color of the physical stuff. That's why the leyline outcrops that are gold give you money, and the leyline outcrops that are blue give you experience, because experience is not tangible. Now, I want to point out one last thing in light of all of this, and that is that I think Mavuika also intends to be the last Pyro Archon, because without the looming threat of the abyss, there would be no real need for the sacred flame to exist. So perhaps it's finally time to return that flame to its owner, the Pyro Sovereign, and by singing one last ode of resurrection, maybe they could usher in a new era of peaceful coexistence between human and dragon kind. And maybe this claim feels like it comes right out of left field to some people, but at the end of Act 2, the very last thing Mavuika says to us is that if we want answers, we need to get them from someone older than the position of Pyro Archon itself. And there are only 3 options for who that could be. It's either Wahaklahun Ubakan, who gave the seeds of the sacred flame to mankind and then disappeared, or Xbalanque, who entombed himself in the sacred flame, or the Pyro Sovereign from which the sacred flame was stolen. Although, there is a part of me that suspects that the Pyro Sovereign and Xbalanque might end up sharing a body, or end up at least in an arrangement kind of like Kanich and Ahau. We're just gonna have to wait and see how that pans out, though. Now, obviously, there is a ton that I did not cover today. Like, I didn't talk about Capitano or go into detail about the individual Saurians, the tribes, or the dragon civilization, and a bunch of other things that will definitely be important later on. That was mostly to reduce the scope and try to keep things as focused as you can reasonably expect me to have them be. Hopefully I accomplished that, but looking at my total recording time, I'm not really sure that I did. I always do feel a bit slow going into a new region since there's so much new content to sift through and research to do, but the plus side of being a little bit delayed is that because everything is so interconnected, figuring out the basics of everything is like finding all of the border pieces to a puzzle. It makes it a lot easier for the rest of the pieces to click into place, you know what I mean? So now that all this preliminary work is done, I am ready for some hardcore theory deep diving, and boy do I have some fun ideas to share. More fun than the ones that I put in here, actually. These are my least interesting ideas. So you guys are in for some fun times. I want to give a huge thank you to my channel members who have been especially patient with me during this patch, and another big thanks to you for making it all the way to the end of this video, because wow, you must have autoplay on, because not a lot of people get here. So I guess enjoy your next algorithmically selected video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.